At 16, he entered Harvard. He then completed Harvard Medical School and went on to earn a Master's of Arts degree in religion at the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in 1982. In 1988, Hammond founded Bethel A.M.E. Church in Boston, a sacred institution now counted among the most prominent and influential in the city. Bethel founds its fount in the groundbreaking ministry of Richard Allen in Philadelphia, where the A.M.E. denomination came into existence in 1787 in the cauldron of anti-black ecclesiastical sentiment. Bethel in Boston, under Ray Hammond's leadership, is well recognized as a place known for its capacity to love, its propensity to embrace the downtrodden, its ambition at fostering the beloved community. The priest, the preacher, the imam, the rabbi, sing in the night songs of luminous light. It seems to many that wherever Reverend Hammond goes, his good works are there. He co-founded the Boston 10-Point Coalition with the Reverend Eugene Rivers. He served as executive director of the Generation XL program. He was leader within the Black Ministerial Alliance in Boston. And he has served on the boards of the Boston Foundation, where he was chairman, the John F. Kennedy Foundation, the Yawkey Foundation, and many more leading nonprofits in the city. We have seen his good works, and we have been gifted through his testimony. Reverend Hammond is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received honorary degrees from far and near, including Boston University, Emmanuel College, Notre Dame, and A.M.E. University in Liberia. And all along the way, Pastor Ray has exuded inexhaustible hope, championed faith in the midnight hour, loved mercy and justice, and embraced a ringing, unmistakable, undeniable, unquenchable, existential gladness. His efforts have been on behalf of healing the nation. He is the husband of another gift of God, Gloria White Hammond, who is a medical doctor and also a preacher who has freed slaves in Africa. The Hammonds have two daughters, Mariama and Adia, and son-in-law Teron Dorsey, and a granddaughter named Ella. The priest, the preacher, the imam, the rabbi, sing songs in the night of luminous light, pleading on behalf of the lost to be found, for the lame to walk, for the mute to talk. I present to you now our most honored guest this evening, the Reverend Dr. Raymond Hammond.
Just when I think I have heard the sort of apex of Kevin's amazing ability with gift with words, I am startled all over again. Thank you so much for that. As a friend of mine would say, that's an introduction my mother could believe. I accept that humbly and deeply appreciate you and your leadership. And thank you for those words. I don't know where to begin, boy. That said, let me also extend a word of thanks for this invitation to my good friend of many decades, Rodney Peterson, who we've been in some wild and woolly places. I'll never forget one time when we were standing out on Martin Luther King Boulevard at a basketball game around 10 o'clock at night, trying to work with a group of young men there. And suddenly, Rodney Peterson shows up with a group of pastors from East Germany. I think it was East Germany, something like that. And, you just never know what Rodney's going to have with him. But it just speaks so much to the heart that he has to not only connect people, but to serve people. And it has been a blessing to be a partner and a friend over these many decades. To CMM, for your work over 53 years, in many ways even before so much of the interfaith work became I won't call it fashionable as much as we know how necessary it is. You are very much on this task, and you're still at it. And for that, we are all better. And for the many friends who are here, if I start calling names, I'm going to get in trouble, so I won't. But I do want to just say thank you all for being here. I know everybody's got a number of things you need to do, but I do want to particularly acknowledge two small young men in the back there. I'm going to ask if George would just have his sons. They were my first welcomers when I came here. These are the sons of George Walter Sland. Forward to seeing them in church on Sundays as they greet me and many others with such joy. Mindful of the time, I'm going to just press into talking a little bit about this issue of healing the American spirit. And I do it with the disclaimers I'm sure you're all aware that nobody, either in so short a time or with the necessary mental compass, could possibly cover this. But I do want to throw out some ideas that I hope will allow us to talk with each other and beyond. So let me begin by taking us back to the 2016 election, and then also the subsequent events. I know somebody said, oh, grown. Because I do want to ask us, why is it that so many people have really kind of entered a state of mourning? Mourning because this primary process ended up yielding two candidates who, as it turned out, were the most unpopular candidates for all kinds of reasons in the history of modern polling. Mourning because that election cycle was characterized by polarization, race baiting, scapegoating, name-calling, sleazy sexual innuendo, and outright lying to a degree that is unprecedented in living memory, and according to some scholars, unprecedented in American history. In mourning, because we've never seen a mainstream party repudiate and then embrace its own presidential candidate in this way. Mourning, because it was unfathomable that staunchly Republican newspapers would declare the Republican candidate unfit to serve and endorse another party's candidate, including the Dallas Morning News, the San Diego Union Tribune, the Arizona Republic, which never in its history had endorsed a Democrat, or the Cincinnati Enquirer, which said it has not backed a non-Republican in about 100 years. In mourning because at least 160 Republican current and former governors, senators, representatives, and presidential candidates felt it necessary to express their complete repudiation of the racism, misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, religious bigotry, disrespect for the disabled, consistent lying, and sexually predatory behavior of their party's candidate. And the mourning rose to a wailing pitch when the candidate with more than 2 million fewer popular votes won the Electoral College by razor-thin margins in 3 states. I understand people's deep concerns even as I'm learning to better understand those who actually welcomed this development, or having held their noses, voted for a candidate with whom they were less satisfied and were just happy that the whole sordid affair was over. I find myself to be of a little different mind than many people. This past election and this current administration have sharpened, in my mind, for all to see, the America, and one might argue global fault lines around race, religion, gender, class, sexual identity, country of origin, and immigration status in a way that is absolutely deniable and that occasions tonight's subject of healing the American spirit. While I'm certainly not jubilant about the damage that has been and is being done, I'm also not depressed. That is in part because I'm actually hopeful that we can wake up from what I would call the post-racial, or more broadly, post-injustice illusion, induced with the election of America's first African-American president in 2008. And we can actually get busy with the work of making America better for people of every race and religion and gender and class and sexual identity and immigration status. Tonight I want to use the issue of racial justice as a lens for thinking about that larger issue of healing the American spirit. And so it was fascinating to me that there was this wonderful piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates in which he said, "There is no post-racial America." And allow me to quote almost in its brief entirety. "The term post-racial is almost never used in earnest. Instead, it's usually employed by talk show hosts and news anchors looking to measure progress in the Obama era. Earnest or not, the questions we ask matter. As many of our sharper activists and writers have pointed out, America's struggle is not to become post-racial, but post-racist. Put differently, we should seek not a world where the black race and white race live in harmony, but a world in which the terms black and white have no real political meaning. The Obama era qualifier is also inherently flawed because it assumes that the long struggle that commenced when the first enslaved African arrived on American soil centuries ago could somehow be resolved in an instant by the mere presence of a man who is not a king. These two flaws taken together expose a kind of fear, not of having a conversation about race, but of asking the right questions about racism. Taking recent events into account, such questions might include this: how can it be that with some regularity the news describes the shooting of an unarmed African American by the very police officers sworn to protect Americans? Diversionary claims of black-on-black crime or gang violence will not suffice. People tend to kill the people they live near. And unless they are police officers, none of these people kill with the weight of the state behind them. The answer is in our past. It's in our resume, it's in our work experience, from the days of slave patrols through the era of lynching and work farms into this time of mass incarceration. Criminal justice has been the primary tool for managing the divide between black and white. We've done this for so long that we're now almost on autopilot. Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, and Freddie Gray keep happening because they have to keep happening. Our long history of viewing African Americans through the lens of criminal justice is the kind of programming that demands Freddie Gray keep happening. The program does not require a critical mass of evil racists in order to be carried out. And we will need a lot more than a good president, even a great president, to terminate it. In the year after the deaths of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile and 5 police officers in Dallas, Texas, 3 in Baton Rouge, the start of Dylann Roof's trial for the shooting of 9 worshipers at Mother Emanuel Church, and allow me to very quickly invite all of you. Tomorrow night we're going to be providing one of the first showings of this new documentary on the shootings at Emanuel. It's a documentary called Emanuel at Bethel, 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. You're invited to come, and it should be a wonderful discussion. The hung jury trial and the trial of Michael Slager, the North Charleston police officer who shot Walter Scott in the back as he was fleeing from a traffic stop. I am more convinced than ever that it will take more than what is happening at the presidential level to bring racial justice to America. So let me suggest that if we're going to heal the American spirit, we're going to have to deal, I want to suggest, with issues of dignity and issues of power. And we will have to do that at the personal and the relational and the institutional and the societal level. But you don't have to take my word for it. I invite you to treat yourself to the writing of Donna Hicks from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. After more than 20 years of experience as a facilitator during international conflicts in the Middle East and Sri Lanka and Colombia and Cuba and Northern Ireland of the United States, she wrote a book entitled Dignity, the Essential Role It Plays in Resolving Conflict. And I find myself saying amen when she writes, people have a difficult time letting go of being treated badly. And if indignities are not directly named and acknowledged and redressed, which they rarely are at the negotiating table, they take on an invisible energy of their own, showing up in the form of obstacles to a fair and equitable agreement. The unnamed violations of dignity are the elephant, the gorilla, and the ghost in the room at your next holiday family meal. The Paris climate change talks. They're there in your congregational meetings. And the next homicide or shooting in the city of Boston. And I learned that lesson really powerfully. I sort of knew this from some of the work I'd done, but it came home for me in an unbelievably poignant way a number of years ago when we first started the work that Kevin alluded to with the 10-Point Coalition. And we were trying to find out why a shootout had almost broken out in Kenmore Square. And when you traced it all the way back, it literally came to one guy getting off of a bus at the corner of Norfolk and Morton Streets in Mattapan, and seeing another fellow who the other fellow felt was looking at him too long, at which point he said, "What are you looking at?" The other fellow replied, "You, what about it?" And that led to a verbal exchange, which led to a fist fight, which then escalated because friends of one of the guys came by, got in, and as they would say, gave the other fellow a beat down, who then had to respond as a matter of dignity and respect by having his boys mount a drive-by on Fessenden Street. And by the time it was all over, we were dealing with a near shootout in Kenmore Square. It turns out that these things really matter. Importantly, it's a lesson I've learned in my work as a pastor. It's a lesson I've learned in mediating disputes between members and finding time and again as I trace the thread of anger, hurt, and conflict back through the long line of conversations and miscommunications. Donna Hicks went on to elaborate a whole series of things that were critical if you were going to address this issue of dignity. And how do you make that concretely a part of the process of healing and reconciliation? But I want to suggest that race justice movements, while they have always attended to the issues of dignity, have also been clearly and overtly about the issues of power. Dignity and power in tension with one another, dignity and power in balance with one another, dignity and power in a complementary and complicated dance. And I want to suggest that we really can't heal the nation without serious attention to the restoration of dignity and the equitable sharing of power. One of the scholars who's really wrestled with this issue of power and dignity writes, why does power matter for dignity? First, power matters for what's called status dignity, because some forms that are among the facts that make human beings need and deserve treatment in terms of human rights. Power matters for what's called conditioned dignity, because some forms of it contribute both intrinsically and instrumentally to the fulfillment of rights. For those less accustomed to academic language and jargon, let me translate it as follows. Our dignity is the basis for rights we possess as human beings. But if we understand dignity also as the fulfillment of the potential that those rights afford us, we need power to rise to the full measure of our dignity. When some people are treated as others, as threats, as political inferiors, their capabilities for reason, conscience, and solidarity, action with their fellow human beings are not properly recognized. Their dignity is not respected. Let me put this in yet another way that I hope you will keep in mind as you hold discussions, not only around your tables, but in other conversations and settings to come. The recognition of another's dignity is not a substitute for the sharing of power. And the sharing of power without the recognition of the other's dignity is a recipe for future conflict. Well, I was reminded of this several years ago as I listened to Dr. Gaylord Wilmore, the author of the influential text Black Religion and Black Radicalism, reflect back over his 93 years and his seminal role in the civil rights movement and the Black liberation theology movement. I was reminded of the battle within the Black community between those who thought Martin Luther King, apostle of nonviolence, was right, and those who thought Stokely Carmichael, apostle of Black power, was right. And really a lot of this came down to these issues of power and dignity. And when you really look at the record, the truth is that both parties were seeking both power and dignity. And sometimes I think we end up being guilty of overplaying the differences between King and Carmichael just to heighten the dramatic tension. And that hasn't ended. I often found myself at times a little bit critical of the Black Lives Matter movement, because I didn't think they were getting fast enough to the power and the procedural issues. But then I realized that part of the problem was I really wasn't listening to what they themselves were saying. When I went actually to the website and began to try to figure out why, when, and how they were going to organize the movement and build the power that would allow them to demand civilian review boards and better screening and training for police officers and more community policing programs and body cams and ending the militarization of police forces and reform of the grand jury system and independent authorities for the investigation of police shootings and confrontation, all and all and all. What they would respond is, when we say Black Lives Matter, we are broadening the conversation around state violence to include all the ways in which black people are intentionally left powerless at the hands of the state. We are talking about the ways in which black lives are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. Well, I want to suggest that if we're serious about healing the nation's brokenness, it's going to take more than just mobilizing people for the next election. That's important, very important. No democracy can survive if the citizenry are lazy. It just doesn't work. I'm not suggesting that certain people don't have to be prosecuted and exercises of power have to be turned back. All that's absolutely true. But we're still left with the hard question of what shape are we in that this occurred in the first place? Are we focusing just a little too much on a person when we need to be asking about where we are as an American people? And what does it tell us? And how ought we respond? And so part of the question that I think we're going to have to wrestle with is how we affirm and enhance the dignity of others and ourselves. And with that, how much power are we willing to build together and to share to make that dignity not just an intrinsic attribute, but an experience in our daily living? These are the questions I believe we've got to wrestle with, because given the challenges we face in our local communities, our country, and our world, if ever there was a time in which we must pull together, it is now. But only the naive would fail to notice that there is a real resistance to that notion, a deep and growing resistance, fueled not simply by racism or Islamophobia or xenophobia and prejudice, but also by a healthy dose of good old-fashioned fear. And it's not just an American phenomenon. You can see it in Poland. You can see it in Indonesia. In the Philippines. You can see it in Brazil, all across the world. People, for all kinds of reasons, for all kinds of fears. I hear it among friends and people that I know, not on either of the coasts so much, but in small towns that are really getting overlooked and who see no future for themselves, and who are really the tip of the spear for that phenomenon that we are seeing now of a declining life expectancy because people are dying of suicide, alcohol, and drugs. And there are millions of people who are in communities who wonder if there is absolutely any future for them at all. How do we speak to those people? When globalization and outsourcing seem to be the order of the day, when the question is no longer whether there will be layoffs, but when those layoffs will take place and whose head will be on the chopping block, there are lots of people who are rightly afraid. When they hear over and over the drumbeat of America's decline as an economic power, when they see already the next generation not enjoying the same standard of living that their parents did, they become quite afraid. When it hits them that drugs are not something over there in dark ghettos, but ravaging their suburban neighborhood and their rural towns, they are freaked out. And in that kind of atmosphere, it's easy to look for someone, anyone, the immigrant, the minority, the poor, the powerless, to define as the enemy and to make the scapegoat. How will we begin those conversations? And I want to suggest that it falls to us, the people in this room, to confront this fear and resistance to change with the simple truth that we are really in this thing together. Somehow we've got to find ways to open lines of communication and remind people of the words spoken by Ben Franklin to the signers of the Declaration of Independence as he declared, somebody must remind, we must all hang together or we shall certainly hang separately. How do we get across to this nation that the babies we do not immunize together today will be the sources of our needless measles epidemics today? How do we get across that the children, urban or suburban, that we don't educate today, we will face as defendants in the courts, as clients in the unemployment lines, and as poorly trained employees in the workforce of tomorrow? How do we spread across the country what's slowly spreading across red states, which is that a crazy, broken criminal justice system, as it functions in the United States, is not only ineffective, it is absolutely bankrupting and a formula for disaster in the 21st century, because no other nation with whom we compete or cooperate spends what we do. And anybody spending this kind of money on incarceration versus education is not only flushing money down the toilet, they're really crippling themselves for the future. How do we have that conversation? How do we get across in conversation that the drug or gun violence crisis we don't address in the inner city today absolutely will visit us in the mass shootings of our suburbs and rural communities tomorrow or today? How do we get across that the environmental issues we don't clean up or prevent today will cause the diseases, disabilities, and disasters we experience now and tomorrow? That the oppression or occupation, existential threat, or colonial conditions we fail to address with courage and a deep regard for the dignity of others will play out in horrific, bloody, and terroristic ways tomorrow. How do we help others understand that, like it or not, we are in this together? And this is a complicated story to tell to a world that's more attuned to the sound bite than to a sound argument. But each of us must find our ways to open that conversation, hold it with people as we are in the process of learning to understand them, and not do to others what we so quickly accuse them of doing to us. No matter how much I might disagree you, do I have a right to other you, to put you beyond the pale, where it's not even worth trying to talk to you, or understand your story, or why you might think the way you do? And it's the charge that I give over and over again to my progressive and liberal friends. That othering process isn't just a one-way process. Who are the people who will have the courage to break out of it and begin to pull this nation together? Well, whether we like it or not, we're in this thing together, and together we can make a difference. Make a difference in a nation that has every reason to wonder whether a country composed of abused Native Americans, descendants of slaves, and immigrants from every corner of the globe is the stuff of dreams or the reality of nightmares. And there's every reason why that many people have come to the place of thinking they ought to throw in the towel and quit, because healing really is one of the hardest things you will ever do. But I do encourage us to hear the words of those who say the choice really is ours. And it's ours to choose whether we remove the yoke of oppression and become what we call the drum majors for justice. I want to suggest we can't lose sight of the fact that we're in this together. And we can choose to be paralyzed by fear or energized by a faith in God and in one another. Ours to choose whether we will get across the barriers that separate us. Ours to choose whether we will find ways to make common cause with many, even that we don't completely agree with, and together begin that process of healing the American spirit. Thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts. And may God bless you.